Between 1930 and 1992, the American Mafia produced dozens of men who held command authority over criminal organizations for decades at a time. A significant number of them died without ever being convicted of running one, not acquitted after a long trial, not convicted and then released on a technicality, never convicted at all, not of racketeering, not of murder, not of extortion, not of conspiracy to commit either. By the accounting of the federal government itself, never spent a single night in a jail cell. The reason is not that the federal government failed to try. The reason is that, until 1970, American criminal law was built to prosecute an act. It was not built to prosecute an organization. A boss did not sell the narcotics, did not place the bet, did not fire the weapon, and did not collect the envelope. He gave an instruction in a room with no recording device, and the man who carried it out went to prison alone. There were attorneys who understood that gap in the statute better than the prosecutors across the aisle did. Their work was lawful. It was conducted in open court, on the public record, under the constitutional guarantee that the government must prove its case. This is a ranking of 7 men who died outside a prison cell, and of the lawyers whose courtroom work kept them there. Number 1 on this list ran the most profitable criminal organization in the United States for close to 50 years. The criteria for this ranking are narrow, and they are worth stating plainly before we begin, because this subject attracts a great deal of loose claim-making. Each man on this list had to hold documented command authority over a criminal organization, boss, acting boss, or the senior figure to whom a boss reported. Each had to die without a conviction on the substance of that authority. And where a man does carry a minor conviction on his record, or a conviction that was later overturned on appeal, that fact is stated in this episode, rather than omitted from it. Several of these men are routinely described online as having never been convicted of anything. That is not accurate in every case, and the record is more interesting than the myth. The sources for this episode are the federal court record, the hearings of the Kefauver Committee of 1950 and 1951, the report of the President's Commission on Organized Crime, issued in 1986, FBI files released over the decades under the Freedom of Information Act, Selwyn Raab's history of the New York families, Gus Russo's work on the Chicago outfit, and the published memoir of one of the defense attorneys named in this episode. Number 7. Joseph Zerilli of Detroit. Zerilli was born in Terracini, Sicily, in 1897, and arrived in the United States as a young man. By 1936, he had command of the Detroit organization, the group federal investigators referred to as the Detroit Partnership. He held that position without meaningful interruption until his death in 1977, 41 years. Through Prohibition's aftermath, through the war years, through the Kefauver hearings, through the entire first decade of federal organized crime enforcement, Zerilli died at home, of natural causes, in October 1977. He was never convicted of a serious crime. This was not for lack of federal attention. Zerilli was among the men detained by New York State Police at the Apalachin meeting in November 1957, the gathering at Joseph Barbara's estate in upstate New York that first proved to the American public that a national criminal organization existed and coordinated. Roughly 60 men were stopped that day. Zerilli was one of them. What followed for most Apalachin attendees was a federal conspiracy prosecution built on the meeting itself. 20 of the men were convicted in 1960. In 1961, the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit reversed every one of those convictions. The court's reasoning was simple and, on the law, difficult to argue with. The government had proven that the men were present in a house together. It had not proven what they agreed to do there. Attendance at a meeting is not a conspiracy. That decision is the foundation of everything else in this episode. It established, at the appellate level, that proximity is not proof, and Zerilli returned to Detroit and ran his organization for another 16 years. Number 6. Stefano Magaddino of Buffalo. Magaddino was born in Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily in 1891, the town that gave its name to the Castellamarese War that reorganized American organized crime in 1930 and 1931. He took control of the Buffalo organization in 1922 and held it for more than 50 years, one of the longest documented tenures in the history of the American Mafia. He also held a seat on the Commission, the governing body established in 1931. 52 years in command. Magaddino died of a heart attack at his home in July 1974, at the age of 82. He was never convicted. Federal and state authorities pursued him repeatedly across 5 decades. He was identified at Apalachin. He was named in Joseph Valachi's televised testimony before the McClellan Committee in 1963 as a boss and a commission member. In 1968, following a search that recovered a substantial quantity of cash, federal gambling charges were brought against him. He was released on bail on medical grounds, and the case was never carried through to a conviction before his death. The pattern in Magaddino's file is the pattern that defined mob defense work in the pre-RICO era. His attorneys did not have to prove he was innocent. They had to identify the single weakest evidentiary link in the government's chain and pull on it: the legality of a search, the reliability of an informant, the admissibility of a wiretap, the medical fitness of the defendant to stand trial. In a system that requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt on every element of a specific offense, one broken link was sufficient. 52 years of command authority. No conviction. Number 5. Meyer Lansky. Lansky belongs on this list with a clarification. He was not a member of the Italian-American Mafia and could not have been one. The organization's membership rules were closed to him. He was something the historical record describes more precisely as a partner, the financial architect of the national syndicate, working alongside Charles Luciano from the late 1920s onward, and the man who structured the casino operations in Florida, Havana, and later Las Vegas. The federal government pursued Meyer Lansky for approximately 40 years and obtained nothing that held. In 1970, facing a federal tax investigation, Lansky left the United States for Israel and applied for citizenship under the law of return. The Israeli Supreme Court denied the application in 1972. He returned to the United States and was arrested on arrival. In 1973, a federal jury in Miami acquitted him of tax evasion. A separate contempt conviction, arising from his failure to appear before a grand jury, was set aside. His attorney, E. David Rosen, argued the medical evidence and the evidentiary weakness of the government's financial case, and the government's 40-year pursuit ended with nothing on the record. Lansky died in Miami Beach in January 1983. He was 80. The federal estimates of the fortune he was believed to control were never located, and the President's Commission on Organized Crime, reporting 3 years after his death, was unable to account for it. The government had built its case on what it believed Lansky's role to be. It could not put that role in front of a jury as a chargeable offense. Number 4. Paul Castellano, of the Gambino family. Castellano is on this list for a reason that separates him from every other man on it. He was not acquitted. He did not beat his cases. He was killed while they were still in progress. Castellano took control of the Gambino family in 1976 on the death of Carlo Gambino, who was his brother-in-law. He held it for 9 years, running it, as Selwyn Raab documents in his History of the Five Families, less as a street organization than as a business concern, with heavy interests in construction, meat distribution, and the concrete industry in New York City. By the end of 1985, he was a defendant in 2 separate federal prosecutions. The first concerned a stolen vehicle and murder operation run by a Gambino crew. The second was the commission case, the landmark prosecution brought under the racketeering statute against the leadership of the New York families as an enterprise, the case that would be tried as United States versus Salerno. His attorney was James La Rosa, one of the most capable trial lawyers working in the federal courthouses of New York in that period. The record of that trial shows a defense conducted with real force. Whether it would have prevailed was never determined. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano was shot and killed outside a steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan, alongside his underboss. He was 70 years old. He died a defendant. Under American law, a defendant who dies before verdict is not a convicted man. Whatever the government believed it could prove about Paul Castellano, it never proved it, and it never will. Number 3. Santo Trafficante Jr. of Tampa. Trafficante inherited the Florida organization from his father in 1954 and held it for 33 years until his death in 1987. His operations extended into pre-revolutionary Cuba, where he ran casino interests in Havana until Fidel Castro's government detained him in 1959 and expelled him from the country. He was detained at Apalachin. He was investigated by the Kefauver Committee. He was called before the Church Committee in 1975 and before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, where he testified regarding documented contacts between the Central Intelligence Agency and organized crime figures concerning Cuba. He appeared in federal narcotics investigations spanning 3 decades. The government convicted him of nothing. Trafficante's attorney for most of that period was Frank Ragano, who in 1994 published a memoir of that work, written with Selwyn Raab. Ragano's account is the closest thing the public record contains to a practitioner's description of how these defenses were constructed, and it is worth noting that portions of Ragano's later claims about other matters are disputed by historians and were rejected by federal investigators. On the mechanics of the defense work itself, however, the account is corroborated by the court files. In 1986, federal prosecutors in Florida finally brought a racketeering indictment against Santo Trafficante. It was the charge the government had spent 30 years trying to construct. He died in March 1987, following heart surgery, before the case was tried. 33 years in command of a criminal organization. Not one conviction on the record. Number 2. Carlo Gambino. Gambino requires the caveat this episode promised at the outset, and it should be stated directly, because he is frequently described as a man who was never convicted of anything, and that is not accurate. In 1937, long before he held any command position, Carlo Gambino was convicted in a federal case concerning illegal alcohol and tax fraud. He served 22 months. That is on his record, and this channel is not going to pretend otherwise. What is accurate is this. From October 1957, when he assumed control of the family following the killing of Albert Anastasia, until his death in October 1976, Carlo Gambino ran the largest criminal organization in the United States for 19 years. And across those 19 years, the federal government never convicted him of a single offense. The government tried. Gambino had entered the United States illegally in 1921 as a stowaway, and immigration authorities pursued his deportation for the better part of 2 decades. His attorneys fought those proceedings continuously, and from the late 1960s onward, the central instrument of that defense was his medical condition. Gambino had a serious documented heart condition. Each time the government moved to deport him or to bring him to trial, physicians testified that he could not withstand the proceedings or the journey. In 1970, he was indicted in connection with a conspiracy to rob an armored truck. The trial was postponed and postponed again on medical grounds. It never took place. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack at his home on Long Island. He was 74. He died in his own bed, in the country the government had spent 20 years trying to remove him from, having run its largest criminal organization for 19 years without a conviction. The heart condition was real. The medical testimony was truthful, and it held the United States government at a distance for a decade. Number 1. Tony Accardo, of the Chicago outfit. Accardo was born in Chicago in 1906 and came up in the Capone organization in the 1920s. In 1943, following the suicide of Frank Nitti, he took control of the Chicago outfit. In 1957, he formally stepped back from the top position, placing Sam Giancana in front of the organization while retaining senior authority behind it, an arrangement the FBI documented and the President's Commission on Organized Crime described in its 1986 report. He held that authority, in one form or another, until his death in May 1992. 49 years. In that period, the Chicago outfit controlled labor racketeering and gambling, and a substantial portion of the skim from the Las Vegas casinos. The Operation Gus Russo documents in detail in his history of the organization, and which federal prosecutors eventually established in the Kansas City casino skimming prosecutions of the 1980s. Tony Accardo was arrested many times across those 5 decades. He was summoned before the Kefauver Committee. He was investigated by the FBI continuously from the 1940s onward. He was convicted once, in 1960, of federal tax evasion, in a case built around a claimed salary from a beer distributorship and the vehicle expenses deducted against it. He was sentenced to 6 years. He never served them. In 1962, the Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit vacated the conviction, holding that prejudicial pre-trial publicity had denied him a fair trial. The government retried the case that same year. The second jury acquitted him. The conviction was erased, and from that point until his death, 30 years later, no American court convicted Tony Accardo of anything. The lawyers matter here more than anywhere else on this list. The Chicago organization's relationship with the legal profession was not opportunistic, it was structural. Gus Russo's work documents the central figure in that arrangement. Sidney Korshak, a Chicago attorney who moved to Los Angeles and became one of the most influential labor negotiators in the entertainment and casino industries. Korshak was investigated by the FBI for decades and identified in federal reporting as the outfit's link to Hollywood and Las Vegas. He was never indicted. He died in 1996, and no criminal charge was ever brought against him. That was the Chicago model. Not a courtroom brawler brought in after an arrest, but a permanent professional layer positioned between the organization and every institution it touched. The unions, the studios, the casinos, the courts. Tony Accardo died of heart failure in May 1992 at his home in a Chicago suburb at the age of 86. The line most frequently attached to him, that in a criminal career spanning 6 decades, he never spent a night in jail, is close enough to the documented record that federal investigators themselves repeated it. 49 years at the head of the most durable criminal organization in the United States. No standing conviction, no prison sentence served. There is a coda to this episode, and it is the reason the era it describes ended. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO did what no prior statute had done. It made membership in and direction of a criminal enterprise the offense itself. A boss no longer had to be tied to a specific act. He had to be tied to the organization. The first Mafia boss convicted under it, Frank Thierry, went down in 1980. The commission case followed in 1986. The men on this list operated in the window before that law was brought to bear, and the reason they died free is substantially that the window existed. John Gotti is the illustration. Between 1986 and 1990, he was acquitted 3 times, twice in federal court, defended by the attorney Bruce Cutler in proceedings that are a matter of public record. In 1992, before the trial that would decide the case built on the Ravenite recordings, Judge I. Leo Glasser disqualified Cutler from representing him, because Cutler's own voice appeared on the government's tapes, and he was a potential witness. Gotti went to trial with different counsel. On April 2, 1992, he was convicted on every count and sentenced to life without parole. He died in federal custody in 2002. The attorneys named in this episode were doing lawful work. The adversarial system requires that the government prove its case, and it requires that every defendant, including this category of defendant, receive a competent defense. That is not a loophole. That is the design. What changed was not the quality of the defense. It was the statute. It bears stating, as it does in every episode of this channel, that the men covered here represented a tiny criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their era. That community built American cities, served in 2 world wars, founded major industries, and has nothing whatever to do with the conduct documented in this episode. 7 men, 250 years of combined command authority over organizations that extorted businesses, corrupted unions, moved narcotics, and killed people. Between them, at the time of their deaths, not one standing conviction for any of it. The victims of those organizations received no such verdict. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The 5 family files exists to document what they found. Not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. New episode next Tuesday. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been The 5 Family Files. Good night from the archive.